Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another funky bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast. Bright and early on July 5th, and it's gonna be another hot day like it has been. Hello, Emotive. Good morning. I hope you got your coffee because it is early. So, let us get it on with our quick bit of plugging before we jump right on in. First, we've got, obviously, YouTube at youtube.com/DJ Funky Fresh Gaming. We've got Twitch at DJ_Funky_Fresh. And then, of course, you can find these podcasts on Spotify and SoundCloud by either looking for DJ Funky Fresh or Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch. That second part's probably the better option to get there. But, there you have it. But, anyway, today's topic is one that I feel like a lot of people are excited for, because several people that I know are very interested in the field of psychology. I have a degree in psychology, and I figured, kind of going over the basis of psychology and giving my opinion on it might be helpful for some people to learn a little bit more and figure out what they really want to do. Because there's a lot you can do with psychology. Obviously. There's a lot you can do with everything, but especially psychology. So, what is psychology? Psychology is the study of the mind and behavior. It encompasses the biological influences, social pressures, and environmental factors that affect how people think, act, and feel. Gaining a richer and deeper understanding of psychology can help people achieve insights into their own actions as well as a better understanding of other people. So, because I had dual degrees in psychology and sociology, which I plan on doing a separate podcast on sociology, probably next week. The biggest thing to know about psychology, it is, at least in my opinion, it's more of a deeper look at internal, like, why do people do the things that they do? It's really looking at the individual and the reason behind their actions. So, yeah. So, let's discuss the different types of psychology that you can study. So, psychology is a broad and diverse field that encompasses the study of human thought, behavior, development, personality, emotion, motivation, and more. As a result, some different subfields and specialty areas have emerged. The following are some of the major areas of research and application within psychology. We've got abnormal psychology, biological psychology or biopsychology, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, comparative psychology, developmental psychology, forensic psychology, industrial organizational psychology, personality psychology, and social psychology. Now, those aren't all of them, but those are some of the major players in them. I can jump into, let's see here. I'm going to read the second list, which has a couple more areas. So I'm going to be repeating some of them, but some of them are new. Here are a couple more of specialty type areas. So here's a new list, and I will be repeating. I'm saying that again because we're repeating. Okay, so abnormal psychology, behavioral psychology, biopsychology, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, comparative psychology, counseling psychology, cross-cultural psychology, developmental psychology, educational psychology, experimental psychology, forensic psychology, health psychology, industrial organizational psychology, personality psychology, school psychology, social psychology, and sports psychology. So those are what is considered some of the top psychology fields that you can delve into. I'm going to go delve into each of these in a little bit. We're going to finish the overview first before we jump into those more major different areas. So what uses are there for, psychology? So the most obvious application for psychology is in the field of mental health, where psychologists use principles, research, and clinical findings to help clients manage and overcome symptoms of mental distress and psychological illness. Some of the additional applications for psychology include developing educational programs, ergonomics, informing public policy, mental health treatment, performance enhancement, personal health and well-being, psychological research, self-help, social program design, and understanding child development. It is difficult to capture everything that psychology encompasses in just a brief definition, but topics such as development, personality, thoughts, feelings, emotions, motivations, and social behaviors represent just a portion of what psychology seeks to understand, predict, and explain. So even though, I've just listed a couple of things, that doesn't mean that's all that it can do and will do. It's just psychology goes into everything you do. Leaders, for instance, need to know psychology to a degree in order to better motivate their followers. A principal needs to know psychology in order to better guide their their students and their staff, in order to make sure that their staff is, motivated to help the children, and that the staff has the right, plans in order to get those children, the best schooling and upbringing that they can. Like, psychology is everywhere, and you just don't know it sometimes. So, what are the impacts of psychology? Psychology is both an applied and academic field that benefits both individuals and society as a whole. A large part of psychology is devoted to the diagnosis and treatment of mental health issues, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the impact of psychology. Some of the ways that psychology contributes to individuals and society include improving our understanding of why people behave as they do, understanding the different factors that can impact the human mind and behavior, understanding issues that impact health, daily life, and well-being, improving ergonomics to improve product design, creating safer and more efficient workspaces, helping motivate people to achieve their goals, improving productivity. Psychologists accomplish these things by using objective scientific methods to understand, explain, and predict human behavior. Psychological studies are highly structured, beginning with a hypothesis that is then empirically tested. And obviously there are some pitfalls with psychology, but that's true for anything. For instance, there's a lot of confusion out there about psychology. Fortunately, such misconceptions about psychology abound in part thanks to stereotyped portrayals of psychologists in popular media, as well as the diverse career paths of those holding psychology degrees. Sure, there are psychologists who help solve crimes, and there are plenty of professionals who help people deal with mental health issues. However, there are psychologists who contribute to creating healthier workplaces, design and implement public health programs, research airplane safety, help design technology and computer programs, study military life and the psychological impact of combat. No matter where psychologists work, their primary goal are to help describe, explain, predict, and influence human behavior. Sure. Let's jump into a nice history. Let's see. Emotive says, that was the thing I was surprised by when studying psychology. That there was so much you could do with it. Exactly. Even if you don't ultimately go into the field of psychology, studying and taking psychology classes helps you in whatever career you are in. For instance, I studied psychology and sociology, and then went and became a lawyer. And now I'm doing contracting. And I can tell you psychology has definitely helped me understand my difficult customers, because I have to negotiate with them. And that's just one small facet that I focused on, but that was because I knew I wasn't going to do anything with psychology directly, you know? So, yes, let's dive into the history of psychology now. Early psychology evolved out of philosophy and biology. Discussions of those two subjects date as far back as early Greek thinkers, including Aristotle and Socrates. The word psychology itself is derived from the Greek word psyche, literally meaning life or breath. Derived meanings of the word include soul or self. So, the emergence of psychology as a separate and independent field of study truly came about when Wilhelm Wundt established the first experimental psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. Think about that. Psychology, as we know it, is less than 150 years old. And most of our strides with psychology have been in the last maybe 50 years. Think about that. Anyway, throughout psychology's history, various schools of thought have formed to explain the human mind and behavior. In some cases, certain schools of thought rose to dominate the field of psychology for a period of time. I'm not going to go into this unless you guys want me to. But the following are some major schools of thought in psychology. Structuralism, which was Wundt and Titchener's, was the earliest school of thought, but others soon began to emerge. Functionalism, the earliest psychologist and philosopher William James became associated with a school of thought known as functionalism, which focuses attention on the purpose of human consciousness and behavior. Psychoanalysis. These initial schools of thought gave way to several dominant and influential approaches to psychology. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis centered on how the unconscious mind impacted human behavior. Behaviorism. The behavioral school of thought turned away from looking at internal influences on behavior and sought to make psychology the study of observable behaviors. Humanistic psychology. The humanistic approach centered on the importance of personal growth and self-actualization. And cognitive psychology. By the 1960s and 70s, the cognitive revolution spurred the investigation of internal mental processes such as thinking, decision-making, language development, and memory. All these schools of thought are sometimes perceived as competing forces, each perspective has contributed to our understanding of psychology. I guess we'll go over each of these a little bit more in depth. Let's see. So structuralism and functionalism. So structuralism was the very first school of psychology and focused on breaking down mental processes into the most basic components. Researchers tried to understand the basic elements of the consciousness using a method known as introspection. Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of the first experimental psychology lab, is often associated with this school of thought. However, Wundt referred to his view of psychology as volunteerism. It was his student, Edward Titchener, who coined the term structuralism. Wundt's theories tended to be much more holistic than the ideas that Titchener later introduced in the United States. While Wundt's work helped to establish psychology as a separate science and contributed methods to experimental psychology, Titchener's development of structuralism helped establish the very first school of psychology. Structuralism itself did not last very long beyond his death. Functionalism formed as a reaction to structuralism and was heavily influenced by the work of William James and the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin. Functionalists sought to explain the mental processes in a more systematic and accurate manner. Rather than focusing on the elements of consciousness, functionalists focus on the purpose of consciousness and behavior. Functionalism also emphasized individual differences, which had a profound impact on education. So those are those two. And then now we've got psychoanalysis. This is Sigmund Freud. Very, very, what's the word I want to go for this? It is, controversial, because it's Freud. So, psychoanalysis is defined as a set of psychological theories and therapeutic techniques that have their origin in the work and theories of Sigmund Freud. The core idea at the center of psychoanalysis is the belief that all people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. As Freud would say, if you have a dream of having sex with a family member, that has deep-seated psychological reasons. So the basic tenets of psychoanalysis is the way that people behave is influenced by their unconscious drives. The development of personality is heavily influenced by the events of early childhood. Freud suggested that personality was largely set in stone by the age of 5. Bringing information from this unconsciousness into consciousness can lead to catharsis and allow people to deal with the issue. People utilize a number of defense mechanisms to protect themselves from information contained in the unconsciousness. Emotional and psychological problems such as depression and anxiety are often rooted in conflicts between the conscious and unconscious mind, and a skilled analysis can help bring certain aspects of the unconscious into awareness by using a variety of psychoanalytic strategies such as dream analysis and free association. So, yeah. Psychoanalysis. People call that hogwash and crockery. You guys should be familiar with behaviorism. Or behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology. It's a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. Conditioning occurs through interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our response to environmental stimuli shape our actions, such as ringing a bell and a dog salivating because he believes he's gonna get fed. It's also the huge debate between reward and punishment, you know. It looks at, you know, how effective detriments are towards somebody doing something versus a reward is towards somebody doing something. So we've got that. We talked about learning through association, and then there's also aversion therapy, where, you know, you associate something with something else, and then people avoid it because of that association. Or the opposite. You associate one thing with another thing in order to make it so that they are not averting away from it. If that makes sense. Anyway. According to this school of thought, behavior can be studied in a systematic and observable manner regardless of internal mental states. According to this perspective, only observable behavior should be considered. Cognitions, emotions, and moods are far too subjective. Strict behaviorists believe that any person can potentially be trained to perform any task, regardless of genetic background, personality traits, and internal thoughts, within the limits of their physical capabilities. It only requires the right conditioning. So, yeah, conditioning. We'll jump into the two types of conditioning, just because behavioral psychology was always interesting to me. Hello, Vapor9, welcome to the podcast. So, there are two major types of conditioning. There's the classical and the operant. Classical conditioning is a technique frequently used in behavioral training in which a neutral stimulus is paired with a naturally occurring stimulus. Eventually, the neutral stimulus comes to evoke the same response as the naturally occurring stimulus, even without the naturally occurring stimulus presenting itself. Throughout the course of 3 distinct phases, the associated stimulus becomes known as the conditioned stimulus, and the learned behavior is known as the conditioned response. The easiest way to describe this is the dog salivating at the sound of the bell. So the neutral stimulus is the sound of the bell. Naturally, if a dog hears a bell, he's not going to do anything. The naturally occurring stimulus is putting food in front of the dog, because putting food in front of the dog will cause the dog to salivate. And then if you pair the ringing of the bell with the giving the dog the food, the dog will start to associate the bell with getting food. Thus, if you ring the bell, the dog will start to salivate. That is classical conditioning. Then there is operant conditioning, or also known as instrumental conditioning. It's a method of learning that occurs through reinforcements and punishments. Through operant conditioning, an association is made between behavior and a consequence for that behavior. When a desirable result follows an action, the behavior becomes more likely to occur again in the future. Response followed by adverse outcomes, on the other hand, become less likely to happen again in the future. A good example of this was, let's see. Yes. So researchers put a bunch of monkeys into a room with a bunch of bananas. However, any time the monkeys attempted to go near the bananas, a loud scary noise went off, scaring the monkeys and keeping them away. This happened over and over until the monkeys just avoided going to the bananas. The researchers then introduced 2 new monkeys to the group, making 6 monkeys in the room. When those 2 new monkeys attempted to go near the bananas, the 4 other monkeys attacked them because they knew anybody going near the bananas would cause a large, scary sound. The 2 new monkeys eventually stopped going for the bananas, but they did not know why. Eventually, researchers then replaced the 4 original monkeys and replaced them with 4 new monkeys, leading to 6 monkeys, 2 of which, were trained via the other monkeys not to go to the middle, and those monkeys then trained the other 4 not to go to the middle, and then none of the monkeys went to the middle. I cannot tell you for sure or not if those monkeys all eventually got their bananas. But another good example, not all psychology experiments are so sad. Here's a funnier one. Another psychology experiment, this one was more a experiment on following the crowd. You know how if everybody else does something, if it can create other people to do the same. This is also operant conditioning, even though it has nothing to do with like punishment or not, but it's still a learned reaction to a neutral stimulus. So a person goes into their doctor's office. Actually, no, it was they were invited to a psychology study. They weren't told what the study was, but they get in there, they sign in, and there's about 5 people sitting in the room. And then every couple of minutes, a buzzer goes off. And every time the buzzer goes off, the people in the waiting room stand up. And so the new person's kind of just observing, watching, not really understanding. But, the people stand up. 10 seconds pass, they sit back down. Obviously, there's no punishment, no reward, but it's one of those, you don't want to be the odd man out, even if you don't know. So it happens again. The buzzer goes off. The people who were already in there stand, because obviously they were part of the experiment, so they knew what was going on. And, the new person's just kind of watching, kind of going like, what's going on? Eventually, the 3rd time it happens, that person starts to stand up, and then sit down. And it just keeps repeating. A little bit after that, another person comes in, a couple of the original people leave, but there are still a couple of the original people. The buzzer goes off again. The original people who are still left and the one new person and the person who learned the behavior stood up. The new person's kind of just like, what's going on? They all sit down. Second time, the new person joins in. And then the rest of the regulars, the rest of the people who were in on the experiment leave, leaving just the two new people. A third person comes in. So the only people left in the room now are the two people who learned the behavior, not knowing why, and a new person who does not know the behavior. Buzzer goes off. The two people stand up still. The third person just kind of looks at them. The other two people kind of just shrug at them. And then, they sit down. Buzzer goes off again. All three of them stand up. That's more of a, not wanting to be left out of the group type of deal. A peer pressure, you could say. But all the same, it was operant conditioning. Well, was it operant conditioning or was it classical? Maybe it was classical. I don't know. Either way. Psychology experiments are weird. They're fun to learn about, though. Anyway. So, next is the humanistic psychology. So, this is a perspective that emphasizes looking at the whole individual and stresses concepts such as free will, self-efficacy, and self-actualization, rather than concentrating on dysfunction. The humanistic psychology approach strives to help people fulfill their potential and maximize their well-being. Humanistic psychology is also often referred to as humanism, emerged during the 1960s as a reaction to psychoanalysis and behaviorism that dominated psychology at the time. Psychoanalysis was focused on understanding the unconscious, and behaviorism studied conditioning processes. Humanistic thinkers felt that both psychoanalysis and behaviorism were too pessimistic, either focusing on the most tragic of emotions or failing to take into account the role of personal choice. However, it is not necessary to think of these as three schools of thought as competing elements. Each branch of psychology has contributed to our understanding of the human mind and behavior. Humanistic psychology added yet another dimension that takes a more holistic view of the individual. So as it developed, humanistic psychology focused on each individual's potential and stressed the importance of growth and self-actualization. The fundamental belief of humanistic psychology is that people are innately good, and that mental and social problems result from deviations from this natural tendency. Humanism also suggests that people possess personal agency and that they are motivated to use this free will to pursue things that will help them achieve their full potential as human beings. This need for fulfillment and personal growth is a key factor of all behavior. People are continually looking for new ways to grow, to become better, to learn new things, and to experience psychological growth and self-actualization. So here's that optimistic look you guys were looking for. And we'll look at the cognitive one when we get into the cognitive type of psychology. So now we're going to go into that huge list of the different types so that you all can understand a little bit more of the different areas. So first up is abnormal. So in order to understand abnormal psychology, it's essential to first understand what we mean by the term abnormal. On the surface, this meaning seems obvious. Abnormal indicates something that's outside of the norm. Many human behavior can follow what is known as the normal curve. Looking at this bell-shaped curve, the majority of individuals are clustered around the highest point of the curve, which is known as the average. People who fall very far at either end of the normal curve might be considered abnormal. It's important to note that the distinction between normal and abnormal are not synonymous with good or bad. So just because somebody falls outside of the norm does not mean that they are a bad person. But it also does not mean that they are a good person. It's just not normal. So consider a characteristic such as intelligence. A person who falls at the very upper end of the curve would fit would fit under the definition of abnormal. This person would also be considered a genius. Obviously, this is an instance where falling outside of the norms is actually a good thing. When you think about abnormal psychology, rather than focusing on the distinction between what is normal and what is abnormal, focus instead on the level of distress or disruption that a troubling behavior might cause. If a behavior is causing problems in a person's life or is disruptive to other people, then this would be an abnormal behavior that may require some type of mental health intervention. So that is what abnormal psychology is looking at. Those behaviors and problems that fall outside of that norm. And they're just looking to, help. A lot of the places that they end up working is with psychological disorders. So types of psychological disorders that an abnormal psychologist would be handling would fall under this section I'm going to talk about. So psychological disorders are defined as patterns of behavioral or psychological symptoms that impact multiple areas of life. These mental disorders create distress for the person experiencing symptoms. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is published by the American Psychiatric Association and is used by mental health professionals for a variety of purposes. The manual contains a listing of psychiatric disorders, diagnostic codes, information on the prevalence of each disorder, and diagnostic criteria. Some of the categories of psychological disorders include anxiety disorders, such as social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. Mood disorders, such as depression and bipolar disorder. Neurodevelopmental disorders, such as intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder. Neurocognitive disorders, such as delirium. Personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, and substance abuse. So those are the types of things that an abnormal psychologist would be looking at and attempting to figure out how to resolve or to remove those stresses from that individual's life. That type of dill. Now, next up is the biopsychology. Biopsychology is a branch of psychology that analyzes how the brain, neurotransmitter, and other aspects of our biology influence our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. This field of psychology is often referred to by a variety of names, including biopsychology, physiological psychology, behavioral neuroscience, and psychobiology. Biopsychologists often look at how biological processes interact with emotions, cognitions, and other mental processes. The field of biopsychology is related to several other areas, including comparative psychology and evolutionary psychology. While biopsychology might seem like a fairly recent development, thanks to the introduction of advanced tools and technology for examining the brain, the roots of this field date back thousands of years to the time of the early philosophers. While we now consider the mind and brain synonymous, philosophers and psychologists long debated what was known as the mind-body problem. In other words, philosophers and other thinkers wondered what the relationship was between the mental world and the physical world. Let's see. Researchers also became interested in understanding how different parts of the brain controlled human behavior. One early attempt at understanding this led to the development of pseudoscience known as phrenology. According to this view, certain human faculties could be linked to bumps and indentations of the brain, which could be felt on the surface of the skull. While phrenology became quite popular, it was also soon dismissed by other scientists. However, the idea that certain parts of the brain were responsible for certain functions played an important role in the development of future brain research. The famous case of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who suffered a devastating brain injury, also had an influence on our understanding of how damage to certain parts of the brain could impact behavior and functioning. Do you all want to know who Phineas Gage is? You will, You will study him with psychology, though. So, Phineas Gage, age 25, was a foreman of a crew preparing a railroad bed near Cavendish, Vermont. He was using an iron tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a hole. Unfortunately, the powder detonated, sending the 43-inch long and 1.25-inch diameter rod hurtling towards him. The rod penetrated Gage's left cheek, tore through his brain, and exited his skull 80 feet away. Gage not only survived the initial injury, but was able to speak and walk to a nearby cart so he could be taken into town to be seen by a doctor. The first physician to respond later described what he found. I first noticed the wound upon the head before I alighted from my carriage, the pulsating of the brain being very distinct. Mr. Gage, during the time I was examining his wound, was relating the manner in which he was injured to the bystanders. I did not believe Mr. Gage's statement at the time, but thought he was deceived. Mr. Gage persisted in saying the ball went through his head. Mr. G got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacup of the brain, which fell upon the floor. In the months that followed, Gage returned to his parents' home in New Hampshire to recuperate. When a new doctor saw him, when they saw him again the next year, the doctor noted that while Gage had lost sight in his eye and was left with obvious scars from the accident, he was in good physical health and appeared recovered. Unable to return to the railroad job, he did other things. So what really interested people was his personality change. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. In this regard, his mind was radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. So what happened was his brain was impacted to the point that he changed. Like, his faculties were not impacted, but what hit was just whatever, yeah. Anyway, that was Phineas Gage. You'll study him at some point. Things you guys would be more interested in: career opportunities in biopsychology. If you're interested in a career in the area of biopsychology, then you have quite a few different options. Some who enter this field choose to work in research, where they might work at a university, drug company, government agency, or other industry. Others choose to work with patients to help those who have experienced some type of brain damage or disease that has had an impact on their behavior and functioning. Following are just a few of the career specializations that are related to biopsychology. There's a comparative psychology, looks at the behaviors of different species and compares them to each other and to humans, like you could work with monkeys. Evolutionary psychologist examines the evolutionary basis of behavior. Behavioral neuroscientist analyzes how the brain, nervous system, and other organs impact behavior. Neurologist treats patients with damage or disease that affects the brain and nervous system. Or cognitive neuroscientist investigates brain activity and scans to research how people think, learn, and solve problems. So that's biopsychology. And now here's the stereotypical clinical psychology. Clinical psychology is the branch of psychology concerned with the assessment and treatment of mental illness, abnormal behavior, and psychiatric problems. This field integrates the science of psychology with the treatment of complex human problems, making it an exciting career choice for people who are looking to work in a challenging and rewarding field. So, clinical psychologists who work as psychotherapists often utilize different treatment approaches when working with clients. While some clinicians focus on very specific treatment outlook, many use what is referred to as an eclectic approach. This involves drawing on different theoretical methods to develop the best treatment plan for each individual client. Some of the major theoretical perspectives within clinical psychology include psychodynamic approach. This approach grew out of Freud's work. He believed that the unconscious mind played an important role in our behavior. Psychologists who utilize the psychoanalytical therapy may use techniques such as free association to investigate a client's underlying unconscious motivations. There's the cognitive behavioral perspective. This is developed from the behavioral and cognitive schools of thoughts. Clinical psychologists use this perspective. Will look at how a client's feelings, behaviors, and thoughts interact. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, often focuses on changing thoughts and behaviors that contribute to psychological distress. And then there's the humanistic perspective. This approach to clinical psychology grew out of the work of humanist thinkers such as Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. This perspective looks at the client more holistically and is focused on things such as self-actualization. There are a lot of educational. Here, this is something interesting for you guys. So, in the United States, clinical psychologists usually have a doctorate in psychology and receive training in clinical settings. I can flat out tell you my roommate in school just officially passed something. He got his PhD, but he had to do a test or something to get into wherever he wanted to go. So, anyway, he just got that. So, the educational requirements to work in clinical psychology are quite rigorous, and most clinical psychologists spend between 4 to 6 years in graduate school after earning a bachelor's degree. Generally speaking, a PhD program is centered on research, while a PsyD, so there's a psychology degree, a PsyD specifically, which is about 2 years versus the PhD of 4 years. Students may also, so the PsyD are more practice-oriented. Students may also find graduate programs that offer a terminal master's program in clinical psychology. Before choosing a clinical psychology program, you should always check to be sure that the program is accredited by the APA, the American Psychological Association. After completing an accredited graduate training program, prospective clinical psychologists must complete a period of supervised training and an examination. That's what my roommate just finished. So he finished his graduate training program, and then he was working under supervised training, and he passed his examination. He did really well. So, but the biggest thing for you guys to know, so a PhD, you get your PhD, you are referred to as a psychiatrist, I believe. And you are allowed to work on your own. If you have a PsyD, you are a psychologist, and you have to work under a psychiatrist. Also, you cannot prescribe medication as a psychologist. A psychiatrist, I believe, is the only one who can prescribe medication. I didn't pay a lot of attention during this because I didn't really care about clinical psychology. I knew I didn't want to do it. So, specific licensure requirements vary by your state, so be sure to check with your state's license board to learn more. And so, opportunities. Clinical psychologists work in a variety of settings: hospitals, clinics, private practice, universities, schools, and in many capacities. All of them require these professionals to draw on their expertise in special ways and for different purposes. Some of the job roles performed by those working in clinical psychology can include assessment and diagnosis of psychological disorders, such as in a medical setting, treatment of psychological disorders, including drug and alcohol addiction, offering testimony in legal settings, teaching, often at a university level, conducting research, or creating and administrating programs to treat and prevent social problems. Some clinical psychologists may focus on one of these or provide several of these services. For example, someone may work directly with clients who are admitted to a hospital for psychological disorders while also running a private therapeutic office that offers short-term and long-term outpatient services for those who need help coping with psychological distress. Now, I understand that this sounds like there's just so much you need to do before you can even start to help people. But if you are pursuing this, you will most likely be working with people probably by the time you're finished with your undergrad degree. You will be in clinics working with people under supervision, obviously. But you will definitely be working with people, and it is a long road to get there. But I know several people who are pursuing clinical psychology. Obviously, I told you my roommate has just, finally is, a psychiatrist, I believe now. But I mean, he's always loved helping people, and, I know he's, doing everything that he can to help people. I know several other people who've just recently started within the last couple of years, and they love it. They're working with people, they're at clinics, they're specializing in certain areas so that they can help people in what they believe is most that they can do. So while it is a lot, people love it. So cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists study the internal mental processes that influence human behavior. This includes understanding how people form, store, and use memories, how people perceive information in the world around them, how information is processed, and how language develops. If these sorts of things sound interesting to you, then you might be interested in the career of cognitive psychology. In order to better understand the sort of things that professionals who work in this field do, let's begin by learning a bit more about cognitive psychology itself. Cognitive psychology is concerned with how people acquire, process, and store information. Major areas of interest in cognitive psychology include language, attention, memory, decision-making, and problem-solving. Cognitive psychology has many practical applications. For example, cognitive principles are often used in the creation of educational materials and software design. This was one of the areas I was very interested in. Cognitive. Cognitive psychologists work in a number of areas. Many cognitive psychologists conduct applied research or basic research on the human thought process. Cognitive psychologists often work at colleges and universities, government agencies, corporate businesses, and in private consulting. Common careers titles include university instructor, human factors consultant, industrial organizational manager, and usability specialist. Some cognitive psychologists may work in clinical areas, while others choose to work in other settings such as education, business, government, and research. Some of the career opportunities that a cognitive psychologist might pursue are healthcare, research, business. While there are some entry-level opportunities available to graduates with a bachelor's degree, most careers in cognitive psychology require a master's or doctorate degree. Those working in applied areas can often find employment with a master's degree. Those applied areas include human factors and industrial organizational psychology, which is expected to grow in the future. Cognitive. Comparative psychology and animal behavior. Here's something you guys might be interested in as well, as you are animal lovers. Comparative psychology is a branch of psychology concerned with the study of animal behavior. Modern research on animal behavior began with the work of Charles Darwin and George Romanes, and the field has grown into a multidisciplinary subject. Today, biologists, psychologists, anthropologists, ecologists, geneticists, and many others contribute to the study of animal behavior. Comparative psychology often utilizes the comparative method to study animal behavior. The comparative method involves comparing the similarities and differences among species to gain an understanding of evolutionary relationships. The comparative method can be used to compare modern species of animals to ancient species. So, why study animal behavior? Studying what animals do and comparing different species can offer useful information about human species. We can do it to gain insight into the evolutionary process, to generalize information to human beings, to study developmental processes. Those are just a couple of the different things that they're trying to study. Major topic of interest, comparative psychologists sometimes focus on individual behaviors of certain animal species like primates to learn more about topics such as personal grooming, play, nesting, hoarding, eating, and movement behaviors. Other topics that comparative psychologists might study include reproductive behaviors, imprinting, social behavior, learning, consciousness, communication, instincts, and motivations. So, once again, comparative psychologists often study evolution, heredity, adaptation and learning, mating, and parenting. So, usually a pretty fun thing. So, next is counseling psychology. Counseling psychologists help people of all ages deal with emotional, social, developmental, and other life concerns. These professionals use a variety of strategies to help people manage behavioral issues, cope with stress, alleviate anxiety and distress, and deal with the issues associated with psychological disorders. Counseling psychology focuses on providing therapeutic treatments to clients who experience a wide variety of symptoms. It is also one of the largest specialty areas within psychology. The Society of Counseling Psychology describes the field as a specialty within professional psychology that maintains a focus on facilitating personal and interpersonal functioning across the lifespan. Specialty pays particular attention to emotional, social, vocational, educational, health-related, developmental, and organizational concerns. What do counseling psychologists do? They provide psychotherapy services, but other career paths are also available. Research, teaching, vocational counseling are just a few of the possible alternatives. Where do they work? Some professionals work in academic settings as professors, psychotherapy providers and researchers. Others work in hospitals and mental health clinics, often alongside physicians and other mental health professionals, including clinical psychologists, social workers, and psychiatric nurses. Others are self-employed in independent practices and offer psychotherapy services to individuals, families, and groups. So a PhD, PsyD, or an educational degree, EDD degree, is required to become a counseling psychologist. Some students start by earning a bachelor's degree in a subject such as psychology or social work, and then receive a master's degree in counseling or psychology before entering a doctorate program. In other cases, students can bypass the master's program and go straight from their undergraduate degree into a 5 or 6 year doctoral degree program. So, here's probably what you're thinking. What's the difference between counseling and clinical? Out of all the graduate psychology degrees awarded each year, 56% are in the health service provision subfields, counseling, clinical, and school psychology. Counseling psychology shares many commonalities with clinical, but is also different in several different ways. Some of the key similarities between counseling and clinical are both are trained to provide psychotherapy, both often work in hospitals, mental health clinics, academic settings, and independent practice. Both can be licensed in all 50 states as licensed psychologists and can practice independently. Some key differences are there are differences in training and education. Clinical psychologists tend to focus on psychopathology, and counseling psychologists tend to concentrate on overall well-being through the lifespan. While both clinical and counseling perform psychotherapy, those working as clinicians typically deal with clients experiencing more severe mental illnesses. Counseling often work with people who are experiencing less severe symptoms. Treatment outlook can also differ between clinical and counseling. Clinicians often approach mental illness from a medical perspective, while counseling often takes a more general approach that encompasses a range of psychotherapeutic techniques. Of course, the individual approach a therapist takes depends on a variety of factors, including their educational background, training, and theoretical approach. So, counseling might be something more for just helping people as opposed to dealing with mental health issues. Next up, we have cross-cultural psychology. Cross-cultural psychology is a branch of psychology that looks at how cultural factors influence human behavior. While many aspects of human thought and behavior are universal, cultural differences can lead to often surprising differences in how people think, feel, and act. Some cultures, for example, might stress individualism and the importance of personal autonomy. Other cultures, however, may place a higher value on collectivism and cooperation among members of the group. Such differences can play a powerful role in many aspects of life. Cross-cultural psychology is also emerging as an increasingly important topic as researchers strive to understand both the differences and similarities among people of various cultures throughout the world. The International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology, IACCP, was established in 1972, and this branch of psychology has continued to grow and develop since that time. So why is this important? After prioritizing European and North American research for many years, Western researchers began to question whether many of the observations and ideas that were once believed to be universal might apply to cultures outside of these areas. Could their findings and assumptions about human psychology be biased based on the sample from which their observations were drawn? Cross-cultural psychologists work to rectify many of the biases that may exist in the current research, and determine if the phenomena may appear in European and North American cultures also appear in other parts of the world. For example, consider how something such as social cognition might vary from an individualist culture such as the United States versus a collectivist culture such as China. Do people in China rely on the same social cues as people in the US do? What cultural differences might influence how people perceive each other? These are just some of the questions that a cross-cultural psychologist might explore. What exactly is culture? Culture refers to many characteristics of a group of people, including attitudes, behaviors, customs, and values that are transmitted from one generation to the next. Cultures throughout the world share many similarities but are marked by considerable differences. For example, while people of all cultures experience happiness, how this feeling is expressed varied from one culture to the next. The goal of cross-cultural psychologists is to look at both universal behavior and unique behaviors to identify the ways in which cultural impacts our behavior, family life, education, social experiences, and other areas. Many cross-cultural psychologists choose to focus on one of two approaches. The etic approach studies culture through an outsider perspective, applying one universal set of concepts and measurements to all cultures, or the emic approach, using the insider perspective, analyzing concepts within the specific context of the observed culture. Some cross-cultural psychologists take a combined emic-etic approach. Meanwhile, some also study something known as the ethnocentrism. This refers to a tendency to use your own culture as a standard by which to judge and evaluate other cultures. In other words, taking an ethnocentric point of view means using your understanding of your own culture to gauge what is normal. This can lead to biases and has a tendency to view cultural differences as abnormal or in a negative light. So, major topics in cross-cultural psychology are emotions, language acquisition, child development, personality, social behavior, and family and social relationships. So, cross-cultural is definitely becoming much bigger in today's day and age. And I think we're going to end up leaving it here with jumping in, which means we're going to have a part 2 on psychology, which I did plan on having this being a multi-series, as I said before. We're going to continue with this and probably jump into sociology next week. This is fun. Help people learn. I know some people, are really interested in psychology, and this is really giving you bite-sized looks into the different things you can do. It does sound scary with how much schooling you have to do for it, but I don't know a person who's actually gone into the field who has said, I hate it, it's been a waste of time. So, yes, tune in next week at 9 a.m. on Sunday as we pick up the next part of psychology and probably starting on sociology. This might be a 3-parter all. It really depends on how fast we get through everything. Because again, we still need to touch on developmental psychology, educational, experimental, forensic, health, industrial organizational, personality, school psychology, social psychology, and sports psychology. So we still have a lot to do everywhere. But we will be ending it off here. Does anybody have any questions from what we learned today that I can hit up while we're just kind of finishing up? And just trying to make sure, we don't leave any questions unanswered. Yes, there is a lot to do with psychology. No questions for this part? Okay. Well, just to sum it up, psychologists really do look to do the most that they can to help people. And they're constantly looking for ways to do it better. It's just a huge system of them just, trying to figure out what's the best thing to do for you. How to help you type of deal. It's a lot, but I believe that, it's a good field for people who really care about others and really want to make a difference in somebody else's life. So, yeah. That's going to be it for today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. And until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.